Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our session on hidden histories, why we need more stories and a broader perspective. The first thing you will notice is that there are no women on the panel here. And this is not for lack of trying. We had two. One dropped out earlier, and one dropped out yesterday. She has COVID, Shruti, so she won't be able to make it. So I'm afraid you'll have to make do with us today. Shruti will be talking about her book tomorrow, I think, Violent Fraternities, out by Princeton University Press. It's an online event, I think. Okay, so there are a few topics that are more debated in this country right now than what should be taught and read in schools and universities right now. And who or what should determine what we teach or study? What is the basis for privileging certain texts over others? How do we decide how to teach our own history? How do we draw boundaries around histories? To answer these and many other questions, we have an illustrious panel with us. I'm going to introduce them in order of appearance. Edward Wilson Lee, sitting to my left, is a fellow and lecturer in English at Sydney Sussex College, where he teaches medieval and Renaissance literature and Shakespeare. He had recently published a work of literary history and travel writing, Shakespeare in Swahililand, which we want to hear all about. And he's currently working on his second book. I think it's completed, the Christopher Columbus.
Yeah,
yes?
some years ago, actually.
All right, yeah. Yes. Which we also want to hear about. Sitting to Edward's left is Ali Megji, who's an assistant professor in Social Inequalities at this university and director of MPhil in Marginality and Exclusion, the course organizer for Empire, Colonialism, Imperialism, and the chair of the Decolonising Sociology Committee. He's also the author of Decolonising Sociology, a book that explores how colonialism continues to shape the discipline today, dominating both social theory and the practice of sociology. And Ali also happens to be a race equality champion for the university. Last but not least, we have James van der Poel, who's an executive producer, BBC Studios, working across science and history. He recently directed Michael X, hustler, revolutionary, outlaw for Sky Documentaries, and is also director of BBC 4's Dark Matter, A History of the Afrofuture. His other production credits include Black and British, A Forgotten History, which he also co-directed, and 8 Days to the Moon and Back. His productions have won numerous awards, including BAFTA TV Awards for Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners and The Surgeon's Cut, which also won an Emmy Award. So let's get into it right away. We have about 90 minutes. I want to leave at least the last 30 minutes for questions from you. So let's start out with a brief statement from our panelists, after which I might ask a couple of questions to you, and then we will open up the discussion. Edward, so tell us about you. You grew up in Africa, right? And then you wrote Shakespeare in Swahililand, and then The Adventures of Christopher Columbus, right? And so tell us about what motivated you to write about Shakespeare in that part of the world, and what was surprising for you there?
So thank you, Kamal, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. And so I thought I'd start off, in order to talk about Shakespeare in Swahililand and some of my other work, talking about the title here, this idea of hidden histories, because it plays into how I started writing about Shakespeare in East Africa. And I'm going to query the title slightly, which is a great thing to do at this point, because it's all too late for you to leave. You're all stuck in here now. And I think one of the things that this story illustrates is that we're quite addicted to this idea of hidden histories being something that is uncovered by kind of Indiana Jones-like, adventurers, right? They're hidden because, they're buried in a temple somewhere, and it takes someone, brave and daring to go out and excavate them. Whereas I think actually a lot of these histories are hidden simply by the tricks that we play as cultures to keep ourselves at the center of focus, right? The things that we do to preserve accustomed ways of thinking and so on and so forth. So, one of the things that drew me into writing about Shakespeare in East Africa, as well as the biographical background, as you say, I grew up in Kenya in a family of conservationists with my nose stuck in a book, and realized by my mid-20s, having come to specialize in early modern literature, that I was going to be stuck in cold, dusty libraries for the rest of my life. I thought I'd better come up with a project that would take me back to Kenya. One of the things I came across in my reading was the striking fact that all of the Victorian cartographic expeditions that went into the Dark Continent in the 19th century, these so-called explorers, the Burtons, the Speakes, the Stanleys, and so on and so forth, they all took one book with them, which was the complete works of Shakespeare, right? Usually it was their only book that they took with them, and they talked very explicitly about the fact that they only took this book with them. And I was kind of interested in why they would do this. Why would you take this book with you, which doesn't serve a lot of purpose, often in difficult circumstances, try to do these cartographic things. But increasingly, you become aware that the stories that they tell about Shakespeare in Africa form a kind of genre, right? So one of the best ones of these is the story that Henry Morton Stanley tells in his Through the Dark Continent. And this, Henry Morton Stanley, for those of you who don't know anything about him, was a consummate storyteller. So he was born, John Rodens, grew up in a Welsh workhouse and went on to fight in the American Civil War on both sides, in fact, and blagged his way into being sent out to Africa by the New York Post when Livingston went missing. He was a kind of consummate storyteller, and he tells one of the stories in his account about a time when he was going down the Lualaba River in Central Africa. And this was a first. He was supposedly the first person to make the descent of the Congo. It was entirely a mistake. He was looking for a different river. So there's a sort of happenstance here. But he tells this story about being approached by the local people who've seen him writing and have decided that this is juju, this is black magic, and they demand that he burn this book. And he tells this great melodramatic story about, it's his copy of Shakespeare that he's taken with him everywhere, and it's carried him through thick and thin, but if this is what they demand, so be it. And he sacrifices Shakespeare into the fire, and there's a kind of general celebration about this. Now, much like everything else in Stanley's life, it's a complete fabrication, and we can tell this from his expedition diaries, which show that nothing like this happened. So it makes you wonder, why tell this story? What purpose does this story serve? And it serves to kind of limn out their roles, right? He's Henry Morton Stanley, the civilized Englishman, bearing this, book of Shakespeare like an ark of British culture out into the Dark Continent, where its survival in these in these kind of unhospitable terrains will demonstrate its greatness as art, right? Like the Ark of the Covenant as it goes through the desert. And by contrast, the local people are illiterate and uncultured and unappreciative of this great genius of Shakespeare. And if Shakespeare is universal, appreciated by all men, and they don't appreciate them, well, maybe that means they're not men, right? So there's a game being played here, and it's a game that I think it continues. The same thing continues right into the 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt gave himself a holiday with his son, his interestingly named son Kermit, after finishing being president, and they took a safari to East Africa. Did exactly the same thing. He had two bearers to carry what he called his pigskin library of Western classics through East Africa with him. So these stories, the story of kind of bearing Shakespeare into Africa continues, and it continues long after, and this is, where the ironies of it become, really sharp. Long after it becomes clear that they're not taking Shakespeare somewhere where he's unheard of. In fact, Shakespeare's being read first translated into Swahili in the 1860s, being performed by Indian railway labourers in the 1890s. Shakespeare is widely known, so it's obviously a kind of performance, right, which allows for a certain version of cultural centrality and cultural universality and superiority and exceptionalism to be promulgated. And there's lots of interesting stories from that book. And so my work, to a certain extent, that is about the tricks that we play to keep ourselves at the center of focus. You mentioned also the book about Hernando Colón, who's the bastard son of Christopher Columbus, and who largely creates the myth of his father as this rational discoverer of the New World. Of course, Columbus was a late medieval millenarian lunatic in many ways. He thought that his voyages were predicted by classical literature and biblical literature and medieval mystics. He thought he had arrived in East Asia, this idea that, in that old Irving Berlin song, they all laughed at Christopher Columbus when he thought the world was round, that Columbus was some kind of rationalist visionary who saw what other benighted people didn't, is entirely a kind of fabrication. There's an interesting story about how and why it's fabricated in that way. So I think, this idea that hidden histories have to be excavated by brave, adventurous acts, as opposed to we just have to recognize the apparatuses, the tools that we construct as a society, as institutions, as individuals, to keep ourselves at the center of focus and to focus on stories that are about us and about people like us and not about people who are not like us I think is a key thing to think about in these kinds of conversations. I'll stop there. I've got other stories I could tell, but I'm dying to hear what my co-panelists have to say.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for that. I mean, it's very interesting how histories, as you say, are hidden in plain sight. And so I'll come back to you later, to ask you then, what is the process of hiding them? But let's move on to Ali. Ali, I know you have done a lot of work on decolonizing as well, which is a project which, focuses on revising or revisiting what we teach in our classes, in universities, and the general discourse that we have around us. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, sure. Really good question, Kamal, and by a complete coincidence, I have some slides anticipating that question, a complete coincidence. One of the reasons why that's such a good question is because it's so timely, right? I think it's near impossible to pick up a newspaper nowadays or just to do a quick Google search without seeing some kind of, let's call it, debate around what we should or should not be teaching in our schools and in our universities. So just to take a handful of quotations for you, the Prime Minister himself talked about the need for Britons to move beyond their cringing embarrassment about empire and to stop the general fight of self-recrimination and wetness that we have towards this topic, especially as it pertains to teaching about the British Empire in school. The then Culture Secretary, Oliver Dowden, even had a summit with heritage bodies where he told them off. He scorned them for doing Britain down by trying to investigate their colonial histories. And then Universities Minister Michelle Donnellan claimed that decolonizing the curriculum involves censoring and taking bits out of our collective history. So there's a general consensus now that you can kind of see that decolonizing the curriculum, especially as it pertains to British history, essentially involves a misrepresentation of British history, which paints a false picture of the past. And the irony, or as you were saying, Edward, the kind of trick we're playing on ourselves is that this misrepresentation could not actually be further from the truth. So I'm not going to give you a really long sociology lecture. I'm just going to kind of go through 2 or 3 case studies that we might be interested in thinking about and talking about, and indeed teaching in our schools, if we were to pursue this, let's call it post-colonial or decolonial line of inquiry. Because what's at the foundation of this move to decolonize the curriculum is essentially a desire to show how colonialism, how enslavement were both central processes in creating what we call the modern world, the world which became as it is today. And in order to show this, we actually have to shed light upon many aspects of history that are regularly erased from our educational curricula. So just to use one really obvious example, you could take something like British industrialization. One of the great success stories of British industrialization was its booming cotton and textile trade. By the mid-19th century, I think Britain accounted for over 50% of the world's cotton exports and basically had a monopoly on the industry in many areas, particularly in South Asia. However, Britain's cotton industry itself was largely revolving around both the processes of enslavement and the process of empire. Around 50% of the cotton that was being produced by the United States via plantation slavery was exported to the UK. So 50% of the US's cotton was being exported to the UK. It would be taken to the docks of Liverpool and then sent to places like Manchester. And then once the cotton was turned into textiles that could be sold on a market, it was sent back to Liverpool and then exported across the British colonies. In particular, the majority of Britain's cotton was being exported to India and the Caribbean. It wasn't a coincidence that cotton was being exported to places like India, because the whole point was that prior to their colonization, India were actually the leading producers of cotton. So by exporting all of the majority of our cotton in Britain to places like India, we were squashing their markets and squashing the need for them to even produce in the first place. In other words, if you want to think about the success story of British industrialization, you don't have to moralize history. All you have to do is to follow the flows of capital, right? Follow the flows of a product. In this case, all we're doing is we're following the flow of cotton as it was in the United States, to the docks of Liverpool, to the factories in Manchester, back to Liverpool, back to Bristol, and then across the various colonies. We're not making any moral statement. We are literally just following the line of cotton, and we are showing that there is a link between enslavement, empire, and, in this case, British wealth accumulation. So what we're trying to do in this whole move to decolonize curricula, instead of censoring the past, like some people have put it, we're actually trying to embrace histories that have been erased in dominant interpretations of the past. So one thing I do with my third-year undergraduates is we kind of do a show of hands. So who's learned about the French Revolution in school? Who had the opportunity to learn about the French Revolution in school? And then who had the opportunity to learn about the Haitian Revolution in school? There's normally at least one person, but no one today. Maybe some people watching on Zoom have got their hands up. But that's really interesting, right? Because if you look at the timelines of the two events, the French Revolution is roughly 1789 to 99, and the Haitian Revolution is 1791 to 1804, so they're happening at really similar times. And indeed, Haiti, or in this case, Saint-Domingue, was one of the most profitable French colonies, who were producing around 50% of the whole of Europe's coffee and sugar production. So it's really interesting that many of us will have had at least the opportunity to learn about the French Revolution. And indeed, we get taught that the French Revolution was one of the central moments in European modern history, or world modern history. Part of the reason why we put the French Revolution up on this pedestal is because we say it's the moment where the masses took matters into their own hands and managed to realize these claims of liberty, freedom, and equality. So what's really ironic is if you actually look at what happened in the French Revolution, it directly contradicted what France continued to be doing in the colonies, which itself was an inspiration for the Haitian Revolution. So if you think about the French revolutionary declarations, that you get in the Universal Declarations of the Rights of Man. You get these claims such as men are born and remain free and equal in rights, these rights being liberty, property, safety, and resistance against oppression. But simultaneously to them doing that, they were actually passing laws which forbid, for example, those in Saint-Domingue from partaking in local politics, even if they were formerly enslaved but now free. So what you had was a direct contradiction of these supposed universal rights, which, as I said, was one of the reasons for the Haitian Revolution. When the Haitian Revolution supposedly became the first successful slave revolt, finalizing in 1804 with the Haitian Declaration of Independence and the Haitian Constitution, you actually did supposedly get a realization of some of these universal rights of freedom, equality, and liberty. However, when we think about these grand universal claims, we're only really thinking about them in terms of how they were articulated in France rather than in Haiti. So I'm not going to go into the whole complexities around the histories there, because there are a lot of complexities. But it's just a note that it's very interesting we learn about one side of history without necessarily its connection to another. And just to leave you with a final point, I think, should we do another show of hands who learned about Nazism and European fascism at school? Pretty much everyone, and rightfully so, right? It makes complete sense that we would learn about the tragedies of, for example, the Holocaust, but just the rise of European fascism much more broadly. It makes complete sense that we would learn that in school. And part of the reason why we learn that in school is because we hope that by learning about it, we can prevent the same horrors from happening again, right? But what I find really interesting, particularly in Britain, around the way that we teach stuff like Nazism and European fascism, is that we completely bifurcate it from the logic of European empire. And it almost makes it seem like European fascism was growing within this indigenous culture of Europe without thinking about the transnational relations that Europe itself had sustained via its colonization of the majority of the world. Let's not forget that as we went into the 20th century, over 90% of the world's surface area was either under colonial occupation or was itself a European empire or a Japanese empire. And once again, what we're trying to show is that by bifurcating these accounts of history, you're actually presenting incorrect histories. You're presenting, as you were saying, you're kind of doing these tricks to place ourselves at the center of history without thinking about the people who lived outside of Europe, for example. So just to clarify that really quickly, the first supposed genocide of the 20th century of the Herero and Nama people in present-day Namibia was actually led by the German Empire. Key figures involved in this genocide, such as Franz Ritter von Epp, were also hired later by the Nazis to orchestrate the Holocaust. So there was a direct link also in the personnel between who was involved in the first colonial genocide and who was later involved in the horrors of the Holocaust. Indeed, even in forming the Holocaust and the logics that it revolved around, the Nazis actually borrowed colonial tactics, for example, from the British Empire's use of starvation in Bengal and Ireland, which was seen to be the most cost-effective way to kill large amounts of people in a relatively short period of time, through to the use of concentration camps in the Boer War, which once again the British were responsible for, and the Spanish techniques of shooting sprees used in colonizing the Americas, as we get captured in Columbus's crusade. And even anti-colonial movements actually took inspiration later from the Nazis themselves. This was really clear in the RSS in India, where they saw Hitler's treatment of the Jews as a model for India's own Muslim problem. So what we see here is not just a case of Britain were really bad, Spain were really bad, and then the Nazis were also really bad, and they borrowed from their tactics. But we actually see a complete, circular movement of history where one project is drawing upon another project, which draws on another project, upon which another project is drawing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's fundamentally what decolonizing curricula is about. It's about not wanting to stop at a particular moment, but keep trying to draw connections, because at the end of the day, since at least 1492, we've had a world of global interconnectedness. So it would be historically accurate to also analyze things as they were connected transnationally. So that goes back to that.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Ali. Lots of questions there. I'm sure lots of people have many questions about what you said and the logical outcome of what you were saying. Right? I mean, so a decolonial history for everyone around the world, but I'll come back to you on that question. But let's move on to James. James, I think you have a few clips for us.
Yeah, I have the misfortune of following this erudition. I'm not a historian or an academic, I'm a hack, I'm afraid. So I rely on the works of people such as these and the work that they produce in order to turn that into, I suppose, a popular versions of it. So I've had, the good fortune of working with some very interesting historians. I had a collaboration with Professor David Olusoga, which shows some clips from the films we made together. The first is from a series called Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, which kind of addresses both those sort of questions around hidden in plain sight, which I think we can show how we've tried to show how this history is hidden in plain sight. And if you look at it again, there's a different reading to be taken from it. I think the second thing about it was based on an incredible data set. So when slavery in the colonies, not the slave trade, but slavery itself was abolished in the 1830s. In order to do so, there was reparations to the slave owners, which often comes as a surprise in this, as we now talk about whether there should be reparations for slavery. There has been, but the reparations were for the slave owners. But in order for the slave owners to be compensated for their loss of property, they had to make a claim. And so there's this incredible census of who the slave owners were at the end of slavery. So there was a series of slave registers which list every one of sort of around 800,000 slaves within the British Empire. And you can see who, there's a project at University College London that was led by Professor Catherine Hall and Dr. Nick Draper, called Legacies of British Slavery, which is ongoing. And they sort of analysed this data set, these records that were in the National Archives, and digitized them. And from that, they created this picture of slave ownership and turned up some really surprising, interesting finds of just how widespread slave ownership is within Britain, or was within Britain. And that things like more than half the people who owned slaves were women because of inheritance, that people owned slaves without ever stepping foot in the Caribbean, but would receive income from them. So we took that data set and sort of turned it into a series of films, and I'll show the opening from it. But I think what we tried to do in a way was bypass some of the language. It's interesting with Prince William now sort of trying to find a language to discuss slavery, and it's very much emotive and to do with we talk about shame or regretful or sorrow or regrettable episodes, and we sort of eschewed all that language. And just sort of, the evidence was so good, we just thought, well, if we present the case, because it sort of diffuses the argument, the moral argument, and it presents more, I think what you're discussing, the foundational element, the contribution of slavery to the making of modern Britain, to the industrialization, and to the wealth that's sort of, to the underlying wealth that is here today, and certainly to the structures, to the financial structures, insurance systems, long-range financing, those sorts of elements. So anyway, I'll stop talking and show a bit of telly. So if we could have clip 1, please.
Life.
So I think with that clip, you can see where we foreground the documents, and throughout the two-part series, we keep returning to the National Archives, and then we keep returning to some of the sort of British landscapes, really, the built environment, to look at what paid for this, who lived here, what are the stories that we haven't heard that belong behind these walls. So that was a way of trying to, I suppose, make the hidden visible, and to show this history that's hidden in plain sight or forgotten. I think the working title when I came to it was Britain's Secret Slave Owners, and I remember talking to Catherine Hall and her team at UCL, and they were saying it's not secret, it's there. You just need to put the two and two together, and sort of there it was. We made another series, and I'm sort of going to talk about a little bit about the aesthetics, really. I suppose my job as a producer is partly the storytelling, but as a director, it's what are the pictures? How do we tell this story in pictures? And so this second clip is from a series called Black and British, A Forgotten History. So another forgotten history, which is there to be found. It's hiding in plain sight. And very much driven from David, actually. David's brilliant conceptualization that, this idea of British history, or there's black history and there's British history as being separate things, and that there's British history and there's international history. And actually, they are entwined. You can't see modern British history without taking on a global culture. It's hard to look at almost ancient British history without thinking of a global culture. So in this opening to the series, you can see that we start at Hadrian's War. This is where the story of Black Britain begins, with the sort of Romans. And that's where we started the series, to say this is a deep running relationship. This isn't, this doesn't start at the Windrush. This starts, several centuries before that. And then really, I think what was, again from David, what came from him was this idea of using plaques. So we erected, I can't remember, around 20-something plaques. I think it was about 4 a program. We had 4 programs, 5 a program, about 20 plaques internationally that marked individuals or individual stories or moments. Some of them were to do with the cotton trade. So, there was a cotton famine, and there was a cotton during the Civil War, the American Civil War. There was a cotton famine where there was a blockade of the cotton from the South coming to Britain, and there was a lot of mill owners who wanted to break the blockade, but there were some mill workers who came out on strike in solidarity with enslaved African Americans. So there's some really interesting connections there. So we did some sequences up in the cotton mills, and we put up a plaque there. So it was a way of sort of, I suppose, making the hidden visible by having these plaques. And also we had these plaque unveiling events. So we had communities, we often had relatives, we had people who were associated with these histories, who were either had been reawakened them themselves or knew of it, or to whom it was news, but also just to show the continuity between those moments and the present. So again, how the world around us cannot be de-yoked from this relationship with Africa and people of African descent. So I'll just show the opening of that series. So if we could have clip 2, please. I wanted to show that clip to the end for a cheap gag, in that, in TV we talk about a certain type of television called Man in Field. So I thought we'd do Black Man in Field, and that in itself would. I'm glad it got a laugh. I knew it was cheap, but anyway, it worked. But seriously, when you're thinking aesthetically, it is that, what happens when you place this person in Britain's ancient landscape? If you make your foundational moment here. Why is David on Hadrian's Wall? And so, those are sort of choices that we make to try and convey the message that this isn't, there's an ongoing relationship. I'm just going to show another clip, which is from a more recent film called Dark Matter, A History of the Afrofuture. And it was for a strand called Arena. So growing up, Arena for me as a filmmaker was just one of those strands, and it sort of asks of you to make things that aren't necessarily, slightly more tangential perhaps than presenter-led television. So it was a wonderful opportunity to make something that was different. But also I was trying to find a purpose for the difference, in that Afrofuturism is this sort of, I suppose it's a tendency within art and creativity within literature, film, and the visual arts, of using the sort of tropes of science fiction and speculative fiction as a way of exploring black history. So a sort of common trope is abduction by aliens, which is, and then enslavement, which, if you imagine things like The Matrix, whereas actually these things within terms of black African history aren't necessarily fictional. They speak to a historic experience. So, but out of that comes this incredible flowering. So you look at the work of Beyonce, that that channels the work of Octavia Butler, the writer. You know, there's lots of, or Janelle Monáe. You know, there's lots of really interesting, both popular and broad culture that plays with this sort of idea of the science fictional black figure. You know, another, I suppose, classic of that is Sun Ra, the jazz artist, you know, who claimed to be from Saturn, I think. He claimed to be from, certainly not of this earth. Or, you know, George Clinton and Funkadelic and the idea of, you know, cosmic slop and the idea, you know, and he had the mothership. I don't know if you know George Clinton, the funk artist, but he, you know, he'd arrive on stage in a spaceship. So, I mean, and you know, I think for black Americans often talk about being aliens. So if you're going to be treated as the alien, why not become it and embody that? So it's an incredibly interesting sort of and fecund tendency, but it's also kind of got a deeper resonance. And so I was sort of interested in the work of, I suppose, theorists of the Black Atlantic and the idea of the Middle Passage as being this transformative moment. But it's also a sort of foundational moment within modernity. The idea often that, you know, Africans in Africa are somehow primitive or somehow secondary, whereas actually what happens in the Middle Passage with this displacement and this alienation and thrown into mechanized labor is actually at the moment of modernity. It's the first, these become the first sort of modern humans, enslaved Africans in many ways, in that their relationship to their labor is one of alienation, that, you know, they lose control of everything, they lose control of their fertility. And so I wanted to sort of express that idea, but at the same time play about with ideas of aesthetic ideas that touched on that. So there's just if we could have, so clip 3, which is just a sequence which starts to look at the sort of, I suppose, the dehumanization of people through the Middle Passage. So clip 3, please.
Let's picture ourselves at the door of no return in West Africa. These portals which take captured African peoples from slave forts on the coast of West Africa to the Atlantic Ocean, into a radically different world where their humanity is denied, their names are erased, their identity is obscured. This is the beginnings of a new world for all of us. It's also the birth point for Afrofuturism, in that it takes African people of African origin, from their homes, from their landscapes, puts them into a science fictional landscape, and turns them from individuals into tools and technology.
Just a point I'd forgotten actually is there's a hidden story of cotton in there, from picking, baling, and milling, you know, and there's some sugar in there as well. And the cotton mills, cotton plantations, and sugar plantations were the most sort of sophisticated proto-industrial organizations on the planet in a way. So the idea that, you know, the agricultural revolution was going on here, but what was going on in the Caribbean was far more industrial. So we're sort of trying to fold in this idea of how the industry required of people and what it does to people, and how that's then re-expressed in things like hip hop, which, you know, one of the significant tropes that came out of hip hop was body popping and robotics, dancing like a robot. So anyway, I'll end on that note.
Thank you very much, James. This is just fascinating, all three of you. So we could just end here and, you know, sort of go home. But we do have some time left, so we'll try to make use of that. So let me start with you, Edward. I mean, when you were talking about Shakespeare in Swahililand, you know, sort of I was thinking of this book that I read by Catherine Booz, a New Yorker writer. And the book is called Behind the Beautiful Forever, which is an ethnography of Dharavi, which is the largest slum in the world. And her encounter with this schoolgirl who's reading, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, right, sitting in that slum, and try to make sense of that. And growing up as a kid in Pakistan, so when I was reading Hardy or Enid Blyton or James Herriot and sort of, these books, I had absolutely no idea what Yorkshire was like or what, these places were like. I don't even remember how I was making sense of that. I mean, I do remember, I'm grateful for being introduced to Shakespeare. But how does this, but I take your broader point, though, that, the tricks, as you say, that we play, they just happen, or is there design here?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I think, obviously, to a certain extent, there's a tendency for people to want to imagine themselves at the center of stories. But this is really why it's so important how we think about what kind of stories we tell. So when I was watching, and I have to say, you should all go home immediately and watch James's Dark Matter film, which is just visually stunning and just absolutely amazing. But one of the things that struck me when I was watching it, I have some kids, one of them is 9 years old, and his treat when his little brother gets put to bed on a Friday night is to stay up and watch Star Trek with Next Generation. With my wife and I were both big Star Trek fans. I'm an easy push for anything that has a bald hero. But, it struck me thinking about this, it's a very white show, right? And what kind of message are we sending here? That not only does asymmetry exist in the present, but it's going to exist forever, right? Look at it 400 years in the future, it's still going to look like that, right? And this is why, these stories being told, Black Panther or, the Marlon James's novels, it's important to think not just about how we, how we address asymmetries in the present. And of course, that's very important, how we address, but how we imagine and start to imagine a future in which it doesn't look like this, And again, so, I think, part of it is a kind of a willfulness, but again, I think there are institutional things. Philosophically, there are reasons to do this as well. I think what connects both what Ali and James were saying, behind them, both of what you were saying is in part the work of the great historian C.L.R. James, right? That we think about. We get taught, as we were all saying, we get taught about the French Revolution because of liberté, égalité, fraternité. But actually, if you want to learn about modernity, about what it is to be modern, to live in a world where everything you eat comes from somewhere else, everything you do goes somewhere else, where you're massively alienated, that the people living in Haiti are the first people to experience that kind of modernity. So why aren't we studying them? So, but again, a lot of these things have these institutional structures which are very, very slow shifting. So we learn about Hitler and we learn about Churchill and, the pumping out of biographies year after year, another biography of Hitler and Churchill and Henry VIII and this, that, and the other. And it convinces us that that's how history is shaped. There are people who are at the center of it, and there are people who aren't. Right? And that everyone else is a peripheral actor in history. So, again, it's very hard to desegregate these things. Some of them are, that kind of tendency to want to tell stories or to read stories where you're at the center of it. But, of course, that's then institutionalized in publishing structures, in, broadcast structures, in institutional structures, what we go to study and what we have people study, at universities. So I think it's a mesh, and it's a very difficult thing to unmesh. But it's incredibly important that we do. It's the most urgent thing that we can do is to start to pick these things apart.
But do you see change?
I mean, obviously, there's lots of people doing amazing work. There is change, but we're so far from where, we should be. And of course, the great danger, I think, is of assuming a kind of Whig history that it's all it'll head in the right direction. We'll get there eventually. Anyone who's looked at enough history knows that that's not how it happens. I think there's a complacency, especially among liberals, that you think, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. But there's backsliding as well, and we live the last 4 6 years have been a shocking, I think, for a lot of people who grow up in a world that they thought was just increasingly going to be open. And you go from Barack Obama, the inspiration of Barack Obama, you go to the next president is Donald Trump. Right, so there's change, but it's by no means secure change. It's not by no means something that we can, rest easy with, right? So yes, change, but not complacency. No grounds for complacency. I'm sorry if that's a bit of a downer.
If I could just stray out of my lane, just and wade in onto history, but I think it's almost this sort of conception of the other is ahistorical, and therefore agency can only belong to a certain category of agent, and the sort of cultural war argument over it is as whether empire was good or bad is sort of kind of recapitulates that idea as if there's this world waiting to be changed for the better or for the worse, and that's what we have to measure, and that's sort of reflected in this the Boris Johnson comment that you captured, and that seems in itself that needs undermining the idea that there's this world without history or without change or without flux or without difference. No. That was this blank slate, and that seems to have sort of never kind of folds into the debate, really. Mm-hmm. What was going on in these other places, really.
Yes. And there's been a long process of constructing that again, because, history is what there is a documentary record for on paper in these particular ways, in the languages that we speak, and so on and so forth. So all of these things that, all of these other histories are erased by simply coming up with a definition of history which doesn't include them. Yeah. It's as easy as that to a certain extent. Mm.
Yeah. So let me bring Ali into this conversation, because you mentioned something to the effect of that we have a tendency to place ourselves in the center of history, right? Which to most people would seem a perfectly natural thing to do. Maybe that needs to be undone somehow. So if not ourselves, what would you have countries, nations put in the center of the history that they teach?
I think I would put relations at the center rather than specific places, right? So what happened in Haiti, but it was also representative of what was happening across, the majority of the Caribbean and the African continent and the Americas, right? So I think that when you put relations at the center, what were the relations between all of these different locations? What were the relations between all of these different industries? That's when you start getting those, you force yourself to actually confront interconnected histories. So British history ceases to be about what happened on this really remote island, and you start realizing, that there's a link between what was happening in Lancashire with what's happening in, in the colonies across the Caribbean, with what's happening in the United States with the Civil War. So putting relations in the middle is really important. And I think also what it does is, just to kind of come back to what you were both talking about, is it shows that there's a difference between change and progress, right? So that's what happens when you start putting these processes in the middle, because you realize, without being too pessimistic, that there's actually a relative stability in the world system. So, black people were first taken to the United States in around 1619. You get civil rights for the very first time centuries later in the 60s. And then you have scholars 20 years later, like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, and they're pointing out, this is the first time in our history we've been given civil rights as black people living in the United States. And yet we're actually economically and materially and educationally worse off now than we were in like the 50s and the 40s when segregation was legal, right? Or even to kind of come back to abolition in the UK, maybe we abolished enslavement in the 1830s, but it was still going on across the world, and we could freely invest in those industries, right? So the bourgeoisie were investing in the Brazilian slave trade until they abolished it in the late 1800s. And at that very same time of the late 1800s, I think, is it George Lipton was his name? We'll call him Mr. Lipton, erected a statue of himself at a plantation in Sri Lanka. So slavery was over, and you can still go and see it. If you go on TripAdvisor, it's got like 3.5 out of 5. You can go on a tour of the plantation and see the statue of Lipton And most of us drink Lipton or have drunk Lipton tea, right? So, yeah, the process is at the middle, and even now, today, you kind of realize, oh yeah, the world's actually relatively stable. Despite all of the changes, there is a stability that underlies all of it.
So I guess the question is, the dismantling of these histories that are taught or that are deeply institutionalized, what exactly does it threaten? I mean, you talked about Boris Johnson, you gave a few examples from this country, but if you look at South Asia, for example, you would see similar moves underway there to write history in particular ways. Is it the same project, or are there differences?
There are always differences. Sometimes there are similarities. So what you see with, for example, Modi in India is a very clear example of, we can use visions of history to promote a very particular kind of nationalism. So there are always those kind of interests. But I think that also, I use the quotes from Boris Johnson and so on just for the sake of the fact that he's prime minister. But there are, I guess let's call it more liberal variations of the same thing. So you get kind of liberal professors or journalists or commentators or people that I imagine you have to interact with on a daily basis, which kind of see these as really specialist topics. And I think that that's one of the major things which we confront. And it wasn't until, for example, George Floyd was murdered that suddenly it was like acceptable to have a public discussion about race and racism in the UK and the British Empire and so on. So these discussions had been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries, but they only kind of became vaguely mainstreamed, fairly recently, which is why the work that you were doing was so amazing, because it was actually happening before it became so mainstream. So I can't even imagine all of the barriers that you had to kind of jump over, or maybe no barriers. But I think that there's just this idea that these are really particular subjects, and it kind of comes back to what you were saying, that there's this idea of British history and world history. And Stuart Hall has that really great quote when he says that he's the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, this is the outside history that is inside the history of the English. There is no English history without that other history. And I think that that's what lots of people need to wrap their heads around, is that there is no one particular geographically specific history, because the world has been interconnected for God knows how long, and it will continue to be interconnected for God knows how long. So, I won't ramble anymore.
Right. Thanks, Ali. So let me come to you, James, and I'll just build on what Ali already said, that you were doing this work when it wasn't mainstream. And what was it like? Broaching these subjects and making these films and documentaries, when it wasn't the done thing?
Well, it wasn't. There weren't that many. I think probably academics faced a lot of the barriers of making the arguments, and so there was a sort of, I think, a sense, certainly with Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, it's such a powerful piece of data and journalism, and had a sort of urgency about it, and an overdue quality about it. So there wasn't a huge amount of resistance. I suppose the thing is, on transmission, what happens is, I think, David gets sort of pretty straightforward racist responses, but there was so many positive responses, I think, and particularly and widespread. I mean, this is anecdotal, but I think the fact that it's so evidently true that actually a lot of people were reawakened to something that they hadn't ever thought about. And so you talk to people and they're going, oh yeah, I was wandering around and I suddenly realized, And the same thing happened to me. I mean, this happened to me. I still love a particular kind of sweater, which is famous for its Sea Island cotton. I always had this image of the Sea Islands. I never even thought where they were, but it's some sort of exotic imagination of the Sea Islands. And then actually Sea Island cotton is slave cotton from the Carolinas, and it's like, realizing that my life was entwined with this and my ignorance. So I think with Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, we went back to the beginning. We went back to how did slavery start in the Caribbean, because it's a story that's sort of not told. And although it's everybody, you kind of know it, almost have to restate African people were brought here. That you have to lay it out. Actually, somebody had to think of this. This was a process. This was an industrial process of moving people. And so I think that was, for me, it was about at what point, what's the entry point? How do you start to tell this story? How do we have to go back to the beginning and do this whole arc? So,
and what was the aesthetic? I mean, so you talked about that as well. I mean, in order to humanize people again, do you need to develop a new aesthetic, or?
I think we didn't. I mean, often, I suppose, one thing you can do is act, and do reconstruction. But I mean, it wasn't commissioned as that, which is a different budgetary element. There's also something. There's almost something about the power of not showing, as well. And I think, as I say, we sort of really spent a lot of time thinking about the documents. And then also, I think one of the things that we probably did, although I say we sort of diffused the language, we did bring David. David did have an encounter with some of the implements of slavery, and so he was, visibly shaken by thinking about that. So we kind of put David in emotionally or he put himself emotionally at stake.
Right.
And similarly, when we made Black and British, he was subjected to persistent racist persecution as a teenager, and was driven out of his home in Newcastle. And we took him back there, and it was one of the last things we filmed because he knew it was going to shake him, and he very bravely he went back and recounted being driven out of his home as a 14-year-old. So I think that putting a presenter at the heart of it. But the aesthetic wasn't. The radicality was less in the aesthetics in those series. It was more to do with the position, the point of view, I suppose.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much. We have 30 minutes left, so let's open it up. Questions? No questions? Yes, please.
I'm just very, very interested. First of all, an amazing lot of things to hear and see. So I'd just be interested. Do you look forward to times, for example, when you can just call it sociology? And I don't mean to be provocative. I mean, just to preface this, I like some of the things you said. So I learned history in England up to the age of 16, and I did the Nazis ad infinitum, as you say, quite rightly. But I feel I learned more about British history when I went to school in southern Africa, and I learned about African history, and wow, I learned about Britain for the first time. That was really, really interesting history. And when I came to university here, a long time ago, and things have changed now, obviously, from what you're saying, I remember thinking, there's something missing here. Do you look forward to being able to just call it sociology, or do you need to call it decolonising sociology?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The publisher picked the title. I just wrote the book.
Blame the publisher. Yeah.
It's a good point, though. I think that I do definitely look forward to the time, but I think one of the really important things about the whole kind of marketing around decolonising sociology or decolonising whatever, because they have a whole series, is that you can't change the history of the discipline. And a large part of what we actually do in these kinds of discussions is look at the history of the discipline. So look at how central figures like, Karl Marx or Franklin Giddings or whoever were reproducing very obvious justifications for colonial interventions across the world. So I look forward to a time where sociology is decolonial, but I think that there still is some kind of value in understanding that at one point there was a canon, and that canon reproduced colonial ways of thinking in various ways. I'm not going to say them because otherwise no one's going to buy the book, and I get like £1 for every copy that you buy. So kind of yes and no. But I think it's a really good question because it does show you how as long as the mainstream is turning a blind eye to these questions, then yeah, it always will be decolonizing history, decolonizing sociology, rather than what it is, which is sociology and history and so on.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I think it's interesting as well, not just how in British schools we represent the British Empire and when we were colonizing other people, but like when I learned about, for example, 1066 and the Norman Conquest in school, somehow it did, when I was learning about it, I didn't really feel like we were the ones being conquered, even though it's called the Norman Conquest. Like the way it was presented was like the Normans were the, and it just seems like there's a difference between sometimes in situations like that, it's like we're all one, but then when it's the British Empire, it's like, oh, we're the winners or we're whatever. I don't know what my question is. Like how should we be teaching like those things where potentially when Britain was being conquered by other nations as well as British Empire?
Edward, you want to?
That's a very good question. I think you're obviously intuiting something that is a deep structure that's very important here, which is that we think about the fact that we can study British history because Britain is a naturally existing thing, right? Whereas actually, of course, it's a shell game. It's the other way around. We think Britain is a thing because we're taught British history, right? It's about a narrative in which we constantly exclude events outside of a certain zone, and the product at the end of that is that we believe that something called Britain exists, despite the fact that, yes, often many of the players in this are not simply British or English in any simple sense. And I think one of the striking things about the conversation we were having before is the ways in which actually these narratives become even stronger as the nation state falls. States are falling apart. So there's fantastic work by, for instance, Rana Dasgupta, who's working on a book called After Nations, about the ways in which the reason why you have your Trumps and your Modis and your Orbans and your Brexit and so on and so forth, because this gives a comforting narrative of the stability of the nation state, right? You're going to go back to the 1950s when strong-jawed men made TV addresses and we knew who everyone was. And actually, it's particularly dangerous in this world in which, all of the profits are being offshored, tax revenues can no longer pay for national services. All of our problems are international ones, right? Global warming and COVID. I mean, COVID, astonishing, I've had so many astonishing things about COVID, but was the utter erasure of the international community. The fact that we could not, in the face of a global disaster, do anything in concert with anyone else, I think shows the kind of erosion of these things, right? And it's particularly dangerous at a moment when when these challenges are deeply transnational, that these narratives of nationhood are becoming stronger and more attractive. And now I've talked myself out of forgetting what your question was, which is quite common in my supervisions, but my students actually rely on it, I think. So yeah, I don't know whether. I
mean, it's interesting because Ali was also referring to putting relations in, and what you seem to be saying when you talk about transnational relations, essentially is you could put relations of production in the center rather than these strong-jawed statesmen in the center of history. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, please.
I'd be interested on your observations on something. When you talk about decolonizing history and the various narratives you provide as examples, I think we need to understand, and you do clearly, that it's not history. If it was history, it would just remain within the walls of Cambridge. It's politics. And we know, and the reason it's politics is that it drives a narrative for what is called restorative justice by various groups who then insist that their politicians implement policies on their behalf. And so my observation, but then my question becomes, instead of being historians, your politicians. And so, or at least the history is being used by politicians to create policies in the political environment. If that wasn't happening, the controversy around decolonizing sociology, dark matter, these would not be controversial. So I don't know quite if I have a question, but rather an observation that the elephant within decolonizing history is that it's history, but it has such a contemporary political flavor that it drives the narrative, and you're behind that narrative because you supply the substance to it, that politicians enjoy in order to create new policies for this country. So, comment.
Ali, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll go really quickly because I feel guilty of talking too much. I come back to, you talked about Catherine Hall. There's also, Catherine Hall and Stuart Hall, they talk about conjunctures, right? So there are moments in history where lots of things collide and it can create, a perfect climate for moral panics, or as you were saying, kind of like these massive political discussions infused with social policy and the interests of everyday people and so on. And I think that that's what we have at the moment, is a conjuncture where there's lots of things going on, the destability of the nation state. On the one hand, an idea of a declining nationalism, but then on the other hand, a desire for this kind of melancholia, this kind of very, once again, Hall talks about this post-colonial melancholia and so on. But the really important point that I would stress is that whilst you have this current debate around decolonizing history and decolonizing sociology, decolonizing this, whatever, right now in 2022, it's been going on since 1492, right? It's been going on since colonialism itself. So when, as you probably know about much more than I do, when the Spanish came to the Americas, there were already people trying to chronicle local traditions, knowing that it was going to be erased by the Spanish Empire, right? Or you mentioned C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James is a great example of someone who was saying everything that we've said, everything I've said, but 100 million times more clear and better. He was saying it at the, in the early 20th century. Before him, you also have people like Du Bois. There are so many people that have been kind of thinking about exactly the same issues, but it didn't turn into a big culture wars or whatever you want to call it. So I am always paying attention to the kind of conjunctures that we are living through. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm qualified to. I'm not a historian. That's my guess.
He's not a historian either. Okay. He's not a political scientist either.
Yeah, it's not, okay. I'm trying to... The idea that history is apolitical, I don't buy, in a way.
Yeah.
The history is politics. Politics is, and not politics as in party politics, but it's it's a positioning. History is a partial positioning, and so you're staking a narrative, and you construct a narrative. And it was interesting the previous question. It's almost a question of identification, isn't it? That there's almost a mythical narrative structure to history that requires you to desire to have a victor. And to identify with that victor. And so much history seems to come through that rubric. And so, in a way, decolonizing it is sort of dismantling some of that underlying structure, as I see it, that sort of underlying mythical structure. So when we get into debates of whether the empire was good or a bad thing, it doesn't really take you anywhere. It's what was it? What happened in these interchanges? What are these exchanges? What do we owe to it? And how do we view our world through that lens, which speaks more, I don't want to say truthfully, but has a broader interpretation that takes on, it's a truly postmodernist position, where you have a multiplicity of perspectives and you have overlapping narratives, but you don't necessarily have a hierarchy of narratives. So that would be my not speaking not as a historian, might be my response to it.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi there. I'm quite interested in how we overcome the gatekeepers. You're talking about how we have more stories, and often it's the publishers or the commissioners who are the gatekeepers, and whether technology and new technology and social media and being online enables people to almost bypass the gatekeepers, and if that's a way to tell more stories.
Who wants to take this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started a career when there was just broadcasting in a way, and actually I started in independent film, which was sort of organizations which would seek to have an independent voices, but you were working in small cinemas, film festivals, the emergence of digital technology in terms of who can broadcast, or who can narrowcast, actually. That's, the sort of idea of the internet decentering everything. It's decentering broadcasters is true in so many ways. At the same time, you can't forget that there's a sort of the underlying scale of broadcasting or of platforms. So if you think of, BBC was once the biggest game in town when I joined it. But, I've been making, recently you look at, Netflix's subscriptions, that's what, 190 million people? You make something for Netflix and it's hard enough trying to imagine an audience for a program as you're making it. You have these bits of story in front of you and you think, who's watching this? What's the point of view? Where do I address this? But when you think of those numbers and that scale, there's still huge power ratios, I suppose, between institutions and individuals who can tell their stories. But certainly there's a way in which the means of production are much more available. The fact that on a phone you can record 4K video on a phone and edit it on a phone and upload it. I think that's extraordinary. In my lifetime as a creator, that's extraordinary.
Do you guys see it this way as well?
So, I mean, I think, it's obviously very exciting. It fills one with hope, but I think to a certain extent that utopian moment, which I think we all had, maybe 10, 15 years ago, has become complicated. We're 15, 20 years into this, and it's not like we're now globally connected, but it's not like I'm actually more plugged into what South Korean teenagers or, people in Chile are doing. In fact, these algorithms that organize what we see, from what you see on your Twitter feed, what you see on your Facebook feed, what you see when you Google search something, what you see on Netflix as recommended for you. In part because of the scale of this information, fall back on patterns of similarity. What do people who are similar to you like and like to look at? What do they like to eat? What do they like to read? And again, that involves deep underlying assumptions about what similarity is. Yeah, and those tend to be very rigidly localist and nationalist and racial and so on and so forth, right? So they assume that I'm going to be as interested in something that looks, that's the same thing the same thing to read or to eat or to watch as someone who is in my income bracket, in my area, right? I mean, ideally we should have an internet that flips that forces upon you the choices of people in Chile and South Korea, just so you think about something else. So I think, in some ways it has utopian possibilities, but the ways in which we design technologies to not just endlessly send us back into a hall of mirrors where we see various versions of ourselves is, I think, very difficult to know, how that's going to happen.
Very interesting. We also have, yes, please.
Hi, this is, I think I'm just following up on the comments that I can't remember who actually said it, about George Floyd's death being a kind of a point in time that almost gave Black people the opportunity to voice what they had always felt and thought. And so, I live that as well. Before George Floyd, my husband's family's comments would irritate me and annoy me, but I felt I didn't have the language to kind of say it. And after George Floyd, I did. And so I guess my question is, what was it about that time? Because Black people had always been killed by policemen, and we've been aware of it. So what was it about that time in 2020 that made that caught the people's kind of consciousness?
Well, Ali and I were on a panel last year, right, in this society discussing exactly that. So I'm going to turn to you then.
Yeah, time flies. So, to be honest, I really don't know, because exactly what you said. Black people have been dying for centuries. And even in the US, police kill black people all the time, and they have done since George Floyd, and we don't know their names. But at the same time, it's not just a US-UK thing, right? Because there are protests among indigenous people in New Zealand, from indigenous people in Mexico, through to Nigeria and Kenya and all over the world. So I have a completely non-scientific theory that it's somehow related to the pandemic and to flows of news in the pandemic. But every other theory that comes up about, like, you know, kept up frustration and so on, it still doesn't necessarily explain why at that particular moment with that particular one person, when it had happened before and it, as I said, continues to happen after. So really bad answer, sorry, but I just really fundamentally don't understand. But what I do think is really bizarre is that it even takes for someone to be killed in the first place, for even a discussion to happen, let alone, you know, the construction of concrete social policies, which we're still waiting for. So that for me is also something that we need to ask, but I doubt that has any answer either.
I think I'd like to hear your perspective on it, because, you know, the media also played a role, right? I mean, when images are flashed across the world of particular things, then they take on greater meaning.
Yeah, I don't have an answer in the same, you know, in that it wrong-footed me, in that, you know, I particularly remember Eric Garner, who was, you know, strangled outside of a store in Brooklyn, I think, wasn't he? Asphyxiated by police, and then also Diamond Reynolds, who live streamed her partner being shot, and so it was suddenly, it wasn't that these things hadn't been visible, or these crimes hadn't been visible before. So suddenly so I found it quite disorientating when suddenly it was like something that had been hiding in plain sight was suddenly visible to the world. And it was very, so I don't understand why. What was interesting from a perspective of storytelling, when I'd conceived of the Afrofuturism film, I'd written it before lockdown. And actually the third chapter was about that Diamond Reynolds case, because it was about a use of technology to portray the experience of blackness in America, and the way in which I suppose black people had taken hold of technology to evidence their experience that had otherwise been denied. And it was almost like a sort of, I think actually, in the interview we didn't use it, but as Eko Ishun says, it's almost like double consciousness. It was like this sort of double consciousness that suddenly you saw something from this other point of view. And then by the time I got to make the film, so I was finishing a project, we went into lockdown, I couldn't use that third chapter. It made no sense, because it was already out there. The story had bolted. And also, it's sort of almost the story had shifted into this sort of almost then looking at this history of looking at black bodies being damaged. And that had its own sort of visual history in terms of... So I think it became... So when I interviewed people to try and make sense of it, nobody had real answers to it. So I think we're still... Probably this is a question for history. Perhaps it takes time.
I mean, and
too early to tell.
And I guess, you know, one needs to remember this didn't just happen in the moment, right? I mean, this had been building up for a long, long time, this kind of marginalization. And at some point, you know, people have just feel they've had enough. And this was just, you know, the way the knee on the neck and so forth just brought all of it together. But we also have questions online. I wonder if we do. So, not yet? Okay, all right. So...
The internet is silent.
The internet is silent. That's right.
Long may it last.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I was wondering what you thought about the Islamic State group destroying the pagan temples, and whether that sort of goes against Boris Johnson's comment, should they have left the past alone, or is it good to destroy the temples because evil people did bad things there?
Yeah, I don't know enough about that history to comment on the specifics, but I guess I can comment on it broadly in the abstract. Let me see if it helps answer your question. What Boris Johnson is trying, from my understanding, what Boris Johnson is doing is he's trying to say values of today are different to values of the past. And inside that narrative is this idea, as we were all discussing, that history is a process of progress, where you have one moment here, and as you move forward through time, progress is also in this linear fashion. So what Boris Johnson is saying in that quote, as far as I understand, is that because progress is a linear process, we can't ever judge what happened in the past by current values because it's a completely different stage of that world historical process. I don't think Boris Johnson would say it like that, but I think that that's the logic which is underlying his thoughts. And so iconoclasm, the destroying of old temples, from my understanding as someone that studied iconoclasm, like, I don't know, in the second year of university or something, I understand that it's typically less to do with these kind of, let's say, academic debates around decolonizing history, and more so to do with replacement theology and trying to squash people who disagree with you and so on. I really don't know the specifics of the case you're talking about, though, but I think that on the whole, I'm normally against iconoclasm, given that it's something that's messed up my family quite a lot, but also many cultures across the world. So, but I really don't know the specifics of the case that you're referring to.
What about the statue? I saw you had Edward Colson in your, in your PowerPoint, and what your thoughts on regarding that?
That also takes on a personal dimension because I grew up near there, and my dad continues to work in Bristol, actually. But yeah, this is the irony, is that you can't judge people by their past, but at the same time, when you see incidences of racism, like, for example, with George Floyd, the very same politicians say this has no place in 2022. So there is a very kind of, let's say, contradictory or kind of ironic approach that so many of our political leaders have to issues of race equality. But the Edward Colston stuff is really interesting because that was not just a statue, but as far as I remember, it had a plaque that read, "This is one of the most honourable." Do you know what it said? Like the most honourable?
No, I don't.
Yeah, it described him as like one of the most honourable members of the British Empire, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, how can we commemorate certain people rather than others, which taps into the whole kind of projects that you were doing with David. So yeah, I find that very interesting. You have similar things happening in Cambridge with the rename, the Seeley Library over at Sidgwick site, close to your home at the English faculty. And that brings me back to something we were talking about ages ago, which is technology, because technology offers you echo chambers, but it also can offer you information if you're skilled in digital literacy, which I don't know how well that's taught at schools and so on, and within homes and so on. But if you want to find out about, the history of Colston or the history of John Seeley or, Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes or whatever, you can Google it now. You don't have to go searching in the archives. My old supervisor's supervisor wrote his PhD on a typewriter where he couldn't access journals online because there was no digitalized internet archives or anything. We live in a pretty exciting time to be able to do research like this. So that was a way of kind of coming back to that, but I can't remember what the question was, actually. It was your question, wasn't it?
Yeah.
What do you think?
What do I think? Yeah, well, I think it wasn't, it's not the past, is it? If you have that statue and there's a present day debate around it, and there's a lot of resistance to it in terms of what narratives surface, what views of history surface, then it becomes a contested present. It's not about the past, and so therefore it deserves to be recontextualized, which is probably what you could say that was an act of recontextualization. But I think it's interesting where it's now arrived. You know, it's fished out. This whole story becomes really rich, doesn't it? And displays that whole contesting of history.
We have about 2 minutes. We can take one question. If there is, yes.
Just bringing back to the point about burning things, so there was recently in the news about the farmers' protests in India and how Rihanna and a couple of other people from the Western world spoke out against that, and then there were videos of BJP supporters burning their pictures. Do you think that that kind of makes people hesitant to speak out about things that are happening in other countries? And do you think that maybe the media is stopping that coming out so much in the UK and the countries where those people are from to protect them? And I'm interested to hear your perspectives on that, and if there's anything that we might be able to do to combat it, to make people feel safer, to have their kind of words about to say about things in other countries. Because I think the main point about that was, don't listen to these people. They're not from our country. They don't know what they're talking about. And maybe they do. Maybe they do know what they're talking about.
Well, you're certainly sure to lose some followers if you go that way, but who wants to take this?
Can I do a 10-second snippet about how I'm always really skeptical of celebrity activists? So, like, Rihanna did that, but at the same time, Fenty Beauty was quite happy to exploit, I believe, women in Bangladesh in the same way that Beyonce's Ivy Park did the same thing.
All right. On that note, we will bring the proceedings to an end then. Thank you very much to our brilliant panelists. Thank you for a very provocative and extremely informative discussion. And I think we all enjoyed it. And whoever was watching, all right, thank you.